I was preparing dinner when a police officer knocked on my door and told me my daughter was dead. But she was sleeping upstairs in my bed. What happened next would shatter everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd called my daughter for 23 years. Before I tell you this story, and trust me, you're going to want to hear every single word, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I've been getting messages from all over the world, and it means everything to know I'm not alone in this. If this story touches you the way it's haunted me, please hit that subscribe button. You're about to hear something that will change how you look at the people closest to you forever. My name is Dorothy, and I'm 71 years old. I've lived through wars, raised children, buried my husband, and survived more heartbreak than most people see in 3 lifetimes. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered on that ordinary Tuesday evening in October. The smell of pot roast filled my kitchen that evening, just like it had every Tuesday for the past 5 years. Routine was my anchor after Harold died. Same meals, same schedule, same comfort that came from predictability. At 71, I'd earned the right to my rituals. Melissa had been living with me since her divorce 2 years ago. My youngest daughter, my baby, had nowhere else to go when that worthless husband of hers cleaned out their bank account and ran off with his secretary. She'd been so broken, so fragile. Having her back home felt like a gift, even under the circumstances. She'd gone upstairs to nap around 4 o'clock, complaining of one of her headaches. Melissa always was prone to migraines, even as a child. I remember holding her little head while she cried from the pain, feeling so helpless. Some things never change. I still felt that same helplessness when she suffered. The carrots were just getting tender when I heard the knock. Not the casual rap of a neighbor or the hurried tap of a delivery person. This was official. Deliberate. The kind of knock that makes your stomach drop before your brain even processes why. I wiped my hands on my apron, the blue one with tiny roosters that Melissa bought me last Christmas, and walked to the front door. Through the peephole, I saw the uniform. Navy blue, crisp, with that unmistakable authority that comes with a badge. My first thought was Mrs. Patterson next door. She was 93 and lived alone. I'd been checking on her daily since her fall last month. Maybe something had happened. Maybe she'd finally. I opened the door to find a young officer, maybe 35, with kind eyes and the sort of careful expression that comes before delivering terrible news. Behind him stood an older man in a detective's coat, notebook already in hand. I'm Officer Rodriguez with the Metro Police. Are you Dorothy Chen? Yes, I am. My voice came out smaller than I intended. I'm very sorry to inform you that your daughter, Melissa Chen, was involved in a fatal automobile accident approximately 2 hours ago on Highway 287. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The words hit me like a physical blow. My knees actually buckled, and I had to grab the door frame to keep from falling. The world tilted sideways, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears. No, I whispered, then louder, no, that's impossible. Officer Rodriguez's expression softened with practiced sympathy. I understand this is shocking, Mrs. Chen. Is there someone we can call for you? A family member or... No, you don't understand. My voice was getting stronger now, driven by a certainty that overrode my shock. She's upstairs. Melissa is upstairs sleeping. She has a headache. She's been here all afternoon. The 2 men exchanged glances. The detective stepped forward, pulling out his notebook. Mrs. Chen, I know this is difficult, but we need to be certain. The victim was carrying identification with Melissa Chen's name, and the vehicle was registered to this address. I'm telling you, she's here. My voice cracked with frustration. Why weren't they listening? Melissa, honey, come down here. No response. But that wasn't unusual. She was a heavy sleeper, always had been. Even as a teenager, I'd had to shake her awake for school most mornings. Mrs. Chen, Officer Rodriguez said gently, I understand you're in shock, but perhaps we could verify. Come inside. I stepped back, gesturing for them to follow. I'll show you. She's right upstairs. The officers exchanged another look, but they followed me into the house. The pot roast smell seemed overwhelming now, almost nauseating. How could something so normal exist in a moment so surreal? I led them up the stairs I'd climbed thousands of times, past the family photos lining the wall. There was Melissa at 5, gap-toothed and grinning on her first day of kindergarten. Melissa at 16, rolling her eyes in her graduation cap. Melissa at 25, radiant on her wedding day to that man who would later destroy her. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it when I checked on her an hour ago. I could see the lump under my grandmother's quilt, the rise and fall of breathing. Relief flooded through me so strongly my legs almost gave out again. "See," I whispered, pushing the door open. "She's right." But Officer Rodriguez was already reaching for his weapon, his body tensing in a way that made my blood freeze. "Sir," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "Sir, step away from her. That isn't." And that's when I saw him. A man I'd never seen before in my life was lying in my bed, his arms wrapped around the woman I'd called my daughter for 23 years. A stranger's face on my pillow, peaceful in sleep, completely unaware that his world was about to explode just like mine had. The woman next to him stirred at the commotion, her familiar face turning toward us with sleepy confusion. The face I'd kissed goodnight as a child, the face I'd watched cry over broken hearts and failed dreams, the face that had called me Mom for over 2 decades. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. Then she saw the officers, saw the gun, and sat up abruptly. "Oh my God, what?" Please identify yourself," Officer Rodriguez commanded, his weapon trained on the man who was now fully awake and raising his hands in surrender. "I'm Melissa," she said, confusion clear in her voice. "Melissa Chen. This is my house. This is my mother." She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and bewilderment. "Mom, what's going on?" But I couldn't answer. Because suddenly, nothing made sense. If this woman in my bed was Melissa, then who was lying dead on Highway 287 with my daughter's identification? Who had been driving Melissa's car? And who the hell was this man in my bedroom? The detective was on his radio, calling for backup, requesting additional units. Officer Rodriguez kept his gun steady while firing questions at the man, who kept insisting he had every right to be there, that this was his girlfriend's house, that we were the ones who didn't belong. And through it all, I stood frozen in my own doorway, watching my entire reality crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. Because in that moment, I realized I didn't know my daughter at all. And worse, I was about to discover that the woman I'd loved and protected and called my child for over 20 years had been living a lie so elaborate, so perfect, so complete, that even I had been fooled. The pot roast was burning downstairs. I could smell it, acrid and bitter, mixing with the scent of my grandmother's lavender sachets and the fierce sweat of 4 adults whose worlds had just collided in the most impossible way. If you've ever had your entire life turned upside down in a single moment, you know exactly how I felt standing there. Everything I thought I knew was wrong. Every memory, every shared laugh, every tear I'd wiped away, all of it was about to be called into question. And this was just the beginning. The next hour passed in a blur of questions, radio calls, and revelations that kept hitting me like physical blows. The man in my bed was named Trevor, and according to him, he'd been dating my daughter for 6 months. According to the woman I'd called Melissa for 23 years, Trevor was her boyfriend who'd been staying over regularly while I was at my book club on Tuesday evenings. But I didn't go to book club anymore. I'd stopped months ago when Mrs. Henderson moved to assisted living. How had I not known there was a man in my house every Tuesday for half a year? The answer, I realized with growing horror, was that I'd been drugged. Officer Rodriguez was patient with me, speaking in the gentle tone reserved for elderly witnesses who might be confused or unreliable. But I wasn't confused. I was starting to remember things, how tired I'd been on Tuesday evenings, how I'd started taking naps that lasted until Wednesday morning. How Melissa always made me chamomile tea before bed on those nights, insisting it would help with my arthritis pain. "Mrs. Chen," the detective said, "we need to understand the timeline here. When did you last see the woman who died in the accident?" "I haven't seen anyone else," I insisted. "This is my daughter. This is Melissa." But even as I said it, doubt was creeping in like water through cracks in a dam. The woman in my bed looked like Melissa, sounded like Melissa, knew things only Melissa would know. But there were differences I'd been ignoring, attributing to stress from her divorce. She'd been eating differently, no longer avoiding shellfish, which she'd been allergic to since childhood. She'd started drinking coffee black instead of with cream and sugar. She'd stopped humming while she did dishes, something my Melissa had done since she was tall enough to reach the sink. Small things. Insignificant things. Things a grieving mother wouldn't question because people change, don't they? Trauma changes people. Divorce changes people. Except now there was a dead woman with Melissa's ID, and a very much alive woman in my bed who claimed to be Melissa, and nothing made sense anymore. The detective's radio crackled to life. Detective Morrison, we've got an update on the victim. Fingerprints came back as, well, this is unusual. We're showing 2 different identities for the same prints in the system. Morrison stepped into the hallway to take the call, leaving me with Officer Rodriguez and 2 people I was no longer sure I knew. Trevor had been allowed to sit up but was still being watched carefully. The woman I'd thought was my daughter kept looking between me and the officers with an expression I was starting to recognize wasn't confusion. It was calculation. Mom, she said softly, I don't understand what's happening. Why are they treating us like criminals? But something in her voice was different. The pet name sounded wrong, like she was trying on clothes that didn't quite fit. When had she stopped calling me Mema like she had all through college? When had her voice lost that slight rasp she'd had since a childhood bout with strep throat? Detective Morrison returned, his expression grim. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you some questions about your daughter. Specifically, about her fingerprints. Her fingerprints? Yes, It appears that your daughter, both the victim and the woman here, have been using false identification. The prints from the body match someone named Jennifer Walsh, reported missing from Phoenix, Arizona, 3 years ago. The woman in your bed here has prints matching a Sarah Donnelly, wanted for identity theft and fraud in multiple states. The room spun around me. I gripped the doorframe so hard my knuckles went white. That's impossible. Melissa is my daughter. I raised her. I was there when she was born. Morrison said gently. When was the last time you saw your daughter's birth certificate? Her social security card? Any official documents? I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it. When Harold died 5 years ago, Melissa had helped me organize all our important papers. She'd been so efficient, so helpful. She'd taken care of everything, filing documents away in a new system that made more sense, she'd said. She helped me organize everything after my husband died, I whispered. And where are those documents now? I didn't know. Melissa had said she'd put them somewhere safe, somewhere I could find them when I needed them. But I'd never needed them. She'd handled everything, my insurance, my bills, even my taxes the past 2 years. Oh God. My taxes. My bank accounts. My house deed. I need to sit down, I said, and Officer Rodriguez quickly guided me to the chair by the window. The same chair where I'd nursed my babies, where I'd read bedtime stories, where I'd sat vigil during midnight fevers and bad dreams. Mom, you're scaring me, the woman said, and now I could hear it clearly. The slight accent that didn't belong, the careful way she pronounced certain words, the inflection that was just a little bit off. Trevor was staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time too. Melissa, he said slowly, what the hell is going on? She looked at him with an expression I'd never seen before, cold, calculating, and completely without the warmth I'd always associated with my daughter. Shut up, Trevor. And in that moment, I knew. This woman had been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, calling me Mom, and she wasn't my daughter. She wasn't even close. Detective Morrison was on his phone again, coordinating with other departments. Officer Rodriguez was asking Trevor questions about how long he'd known Melissa, when they'd met, what she'd told him about her past. And I was sitting in my chair, watching 23 years of memories reshape themselves into lies. But there was something else growing inside me, something hot and sharp and unfamiliar. It wasn't just grief for my daughter, who I now realized might have been dead for years. It wasn't just violation at having my home and heart invaded by strangers. It was rage. Pure, clean, burning rage at the woman who had stolen my daughter's identity, my love, my trust, my home, and God knows what else. The woman who had drugged me so she could live a lie with her boyfriend in my house. The woman who had let me grieve for a child who might have died while she was already pretending to be her. This woman had stolen years of my life. She'd let me worry about Melissa's headaches, her sadness, her struggles, when all along she was probably laughing at the pathetic old woman who was so easily fooled. Mrs. Chen. Officer Rodriguez was speaking to me, but his voice seemed to come from far away. Mrs. Chen, are you all right? I looked up at him, then at the woman on my bed who was watching me with calculating eyes, trying to figure out how much I'd realized. No, I said quietly. I'm not all right. But I'm going to be. Because even as my world collapsed around me, even as I faced the reality that my daughter might be dead and had been replaced by an imposter, I was already starting to plan. This woman had underestimated me. She'd seen a grieving widow, a lonely old woman desperate for family, someone easily manipulated and controlled. She'd thought she could drug me, lie to me, steal from me, and I'd never figure it out. She was wrong. And she was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. Detective Morrison ended his phone call and turned back to us with the kind of expression that meant more bad news was coming. I braced myself, still reeling from the revelation that the woman I'd been caring for wasn't my daughter. Mrs. Chen, we've located your daughter's real Social Security records. Melissa Chen died in a car accident in Denver, Colorado, 4 years ago. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. 4 years. My daughter had been dead for 4 years, and this woman, this stranger, had been living her life, sleeping in her childhood bed, accepting my love and care while knowing my real child was gone. The woman on the bed, Sarah, the detective had called her, finally dropped her act. The confused, scared expression vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Prove it," she said simply. Trevor stared at her in shock. "Melissa, what are you saying? What are you?" "My name isn't Melissa, you idiot." Sarah's voice was different now, sharper, with an edge I'd never heard before. "It never was." "But we've been together for 6 months, Trevor stammered. "You told me about your childhood, your mother, your... I told you what you needed to hear to keep you around." Sarah sat up straighter, and I could see her transforming before my eyes from the grieving, fragile daughter I'd thought I knew into someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Detective Morrison was taking notes rapidly. "Sarah Donnelly, you're under arrest for identity theft, fraud, and..." "Wait," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. Everyone turned to look at me, and I could see surprise in their faces. I suppose they expected me to be completely broken by now, a sobbing old woman overwhelmed by the truth. But I wasn't broken. I was angry. And I was thinking more clearly than I had in years. "Before you arrest her," I said calmly, "I want to know everything. I want to know exactly what she's done to my life, to my finances, to my daughter's memory. I want to know how she found out about Melissa, how she got her identification, how long she's been planning this." Sarah laughed, actually laughed. "Oh, Dorothy. You really want to know? You want the whole ugly truth?" "Yes," I said, meeting her eyes steadily. "Every word." "Fine." Sarah swung her legs over the side of the bed, completely comfortable now that the facade was over. "Your precious Melissa wasn't the angel you thought she was. She was broke, desperate, and stupid enough to trust the wrong person." My hands clenched into fists, but I kept my voice level. "Go on." "I met her in a bar in Denver. She was crying into her beer about her divorce, about how her husband had cleaned her out, about how she was too proud to come crawling back to mommy for help. She showed me pictures of you, told me all about your house, your routines, how you'd taken care of daddy until he died." Each word was a knife twist, but I forced myself to listen. She was going to stay with some friend, try to get back on her feet. But she never made it there. Sarah's smile was cruel. "Car accidents are so unpredictable." "You killed her." The words came out as a whisper. I didn't have to. But I may have encouraged the accident. Bad brakes are such a common problem with older cars. Trevor looked like he was going to be sick. Detective Morrison was signaling for the officers outside to come in. But I held up my hand again. "How did you know it would work? How did you know I wouldn't realize you weren't my daughter?" Sarah shrugged. "Grieving parents see what they want to see. Melissa told me you hadn't seen her in 2 years because of the divorce drama. People change. Trauma changes them. I just had to be close enough to pass for a daughter you wanted back so badly you'd overlook the differences. And you studied me. My routines, my habits. For months before I showed up at your door. I watched you through the windows, learned your schedule. I knew you went to book club on Tuesdays, that you got your hair done every other Thursday, that you talked to Mrs. Patterson over the fence every morning while you watered your roses." The level of calculation was breathtaking. This woman had studied me like a predator studies prey, learning every detail of my life so she could slip into it seamlessly. "The tea," I said suddenly. "You were drugging me." "Just a mild sedative. Enough to make you sleep deeply on Tuesday nights so Trevor could visit." Though I have to say, you were easier to fool when you were a little foggy. She looked genuinely amused. Did you really think you were just getting more tired in your old age? Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. That's enough. We need to process the scene and... No, I said firmly. Not yet. Sarah, what did you do with my documents? My financial information? She tilted her head, considering how much to reveal. Well, since I'm going to prison anyway, I've been slowly transferring your assets into accounts I can access. Your social security checks have been going into a joint account for months. For emergencies, I told you, remember? Your house is in the process of being sold to a shell company I own. By the time anyone noticed, I'd have disappeared with Trevor to somewhere without extradition treaties. Trevor was staring at her in horror. You were planning to leave? With my money too? Sarah actually laughed at him. Oh, sweetie. Did you really think I cared about you? You were just convenient. A way to make the domestic situation look normal, and someone else to blame if things went wrong. That's when Trevor lunged at her. The next few minutes were chaos, officers restraining Trevor, Sarah being handcuffed and read her rights, Detective Morrison trying to get statements from everyone while coordinating with the Financial Crimes Unit. But through it all, I sat in my chair, absorbing the magnitude of what had been done to me. This woman hadn't just stolen my daughter's identity, she'd stolen my life. My home. My money. My memories. She'd taken my love for my child and twisted it into a weapon against me. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated me. She'd seen a lonely old woman, vulnerable and easily manipulated. She hadn't seen the woman who'd raised 3 children through their father's deployments, who'd managed a household on a military salary, who'd fought insurance companies and bureaucrats and doctors to get the care Harold needed in his final years. She hadn't seen the woman who'd been quietly observing her for months, noting the small inconsistencies, filing away questions that didn't quite make sense. And she definitely hadn't seen the woman who was now going to dedicate whatever time she had left to making sure Sarah Donnelly paid for every single thing she'd stolen. As they led her out of my bedroom in handcuffs, Sarah looked back at me one last time. Maybe she expected to see a broken old woman, destroyed by the revelation of how completely she'd been fooled. Instead, she saw me standing up from my chair, my spine straight, my eyes clear and filled with a purpose that hadn't been there in years. This isn't over, I told her quietly. She smirked. What are you going to do, old woman? You can barely take care of yourself. We'll see, I said. And I meant it. Because Sarah Donnelly had just made the biggest mistake of her criminal career. She'd given me a reason to live again. A purpose. A target for all the grief and rage and loss I'd been carrying for years. She thought she'd destroyed me. Instead, she'd just awakened something I'd thought was dead and buried with my husband. She'd awakened the fighter. After the police left and the chaos settled, I found myself alone in my house for the first time in what felt like years. The silence was deafening. No footsteps upstairs, no voice calling down for tea, no presence that I'd thought was my daughter but had been my enemy all along. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, real coffee, not the herbal tea Sarah had been pushing on me, and tried to process everything. The pot roast had burned to a crisp, filling the house with acrid smoke that seemed fitting somehow. Everything in my life had been burning for years, I just hadn't smelled the smoke. Detective Morrison had given me his card and promised someone from the Financial Crimes Unit would contact me in the morning. They'd started the process of freezing the accounts Sarah had access to, but he'd been honest about the challenges ahead. Identity theft cases were complex, especially when the victim had willingly given access to documents and accounts. Proving financial abuse of an elderly person would take time, and there was no guarantee I'd recover everything she'd stolen. But I wasn't waiting for the police to handle this. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through Harold's old files. The ones Sarah had organized for me but which I'd been too trusting to verify. It took me hours to find them, buried in the back of the closet under seasonal clothes I never wore anymore. My hands shook as I opened the file box. Birth certificates, mine and Harold's, but not Melissa's. Social security cards, again, ours but not my daughter's. Marriage license, Harold's military records, insurance policies. But every document related to Melissa was gone. In their place were papers I'd never seen before. A joint bank account opened 18 months ago with my signature, except I'd never opened that account. A power of attorney document giving Melissa Chen authority over my finances in case of incapacity, my signature again, but I had no memory of signing it. The worst was at the bottom of the box. A deed transfer, moving my house into a trust controlled by Melissa Chen for tax purposes. My signature, my initials on every page, witnessed by people I'd never met. I stared at those documents until my eyes burned, trying to remember signing them, trying to remember any conversation about trusts or tax benefits or financial planning. But there was nothing. Just blank spaces in my memory that lined up perfectly with Tuesday evenings over the past 2 years. How many times had Sarah drugged me? How many times had I signed documents while under the influence, trusting the woman I thought was my daughter to take care of me? I made myself a list. 1. Contact bank about joint account. 2. Find lawyer specializing in financial elder abuse. 3. Contact Harold's old military buddy Jim. He was a private investigator now. 4. Find out everything possible about Sarah Donnelly. 5. Learn what really happened to my Melissa. By sunrise, I had a plan. The bank was my first stop. I'd been doing business with First National for 43 years, since Harold and I bought our first house. The manager, Carol Martinez, had known me for over a decade. She took one look at me walking into her office at 9 a.m. sharp and knew something was wrong. "Dorothy, honey, you look like you haven't slept. Is everything okay?" I told her everything. The whole story, from the police at my door to discovering that my daughter had been dead for 4 years to learning that my entire life had been stolen by a stranger. Carol's expression grew more horrified with each revelation. "Oh my God, Dorothy. I'm so sorry. And I have to tell you, the woman claiming to be your daughter was just here yesterday. She wanted to make a large withdrawal." My stomach dropped. "How large?" $4,000 to $7,000. She said it was for a medical emergency, that you were having heart problems and needed surgery not covered by insurance. $4,000 to $7,000. Nearly everything Harold and I had saved over 45 years of marriage. Did you give it to her? Carol looked uncomfortable. She had all the right identification, all the proper authorization. She knew your social security number, your mother's maiden name, all the security questions. And she's been on the account for over a year. But did you give it to her? I told her we needed to verify such a large withdrawal with you first. She said you were in surgery and couldn't be disturbed, but she'd come back today with medical documentation. Thank God for small favors. Carol, I need that account frozen immediately. And I need copies of every transaction she's made in the past 2 years. Of course. Dorothy, I'm so sorry. If we'd known. You couldn't have known, I said, though part of me wondered how many red flags had been overlooked because Sarah had played her role so perfectly. But I need to know, are there other accounts? Other transactions? Carol's fingers flew over her computer keyboard, pulling up records that made my heart sink further with each screen. 3 credit cards opened in my name. A home equity line of credit against the house, $75,000, nearly maxed out. Investment accounts I'd never authorized, containing stocks that had mysteriously lost most of their value just before being sold at a loss. Sarah hadn't just stolen my identity. She'd systematically looted everything Harold and I had built together, and she'd been careful about it. Small withdrawals, reasonable explanations, gradual increases that wouldn't trigger automatic fraud alerts. How much? I asked quietly. Carol's face was pale. From what I can see here, and cross-referencing with other institutions, Dorothy, I think she may have taken close to $200,000 over the past 2 years. $200,000. My house was worth maybe $180,000 in the current market. She'd essentially stolen everything I owned and then some. But instead of despair, I felt that same cold rage from the night before settling deeper into my bones. She'd been thorough, I'd give her that. Professional. She'd probably done this before, to other grieving parents, other vulnerable elderly people. That was going to be her downfall. Carol, I need something else. I need the security camera footage from every time she was here. I need transaction records, signature samples, everything you have. And I need to know what banks these other accounts are with. Dorothy, the police. The police are handling the criminal case. This is personal. Carol studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. Give me an hour. I'll have everything copied for you. While I waited, I called Jim Patterson. Harold's old army buddy had gone into private investigation after retiring from the service, specializing in insurance fraud and background checks. He'd helped us once before when Harold's identity was stolen for credit card fraud. A simple case compared to this, but Jim had been thorough and discreet. Dorothy, Jesus, I haven't heard from you since Harold's funeral. How are you holding up? I gave him the abbreviated version, focusing on the facts. Jim listened without interruption, occasionally making notes I could hear scratching across paper. Son of a bitch, he said finally. Professional job. This wasn't some opportunistic scammer, Dorothy. This was planned, researched, executed by someone who's done it before. That's what I thought. Can you help me? Hell yes. This kind of thing, it makes me sick. Give me Sarah Donnelly's full name and approximate age, and I'll start running background checks. I've got contacts in law enforcement who can access databases the public can't. Jim, I need to know everything. Where she came from, what she's done before, who else she might have hurt. Everything. You'll have it. But Dorothy, what are you planning to do with this information? I looked out the bank window at the parking lot where I'd taught Melissa to drive 15 years ago, where we'd sat in the car afterward, both of us crying because she'd been so nervous about hitting something. Except that wasn't my Melissa. My Melissa had been dead for 4 years, killed by the woman who'd stolen her identity and then stolen my love for her. I'm going to make sure she pays for what she's done, I said. All of it. Dorothy, be careful. People like this, they're dangerous when they're cornered. So am I, Jim. So am I. After I hung up, I sat in that bank lobby and let myself feel the full weight of my loss for the first time. Not just the money, though that hurt. Not just the violation of my trust and my home, though that burned like acid. My daughter was gone. Had been gone for 4 years. And I'd never gotten to say goodbye, never gotten to grieve properly, never gotten to hold her hand one last time. Sarah Donnelly had stolen that from me too. She'd stolen my grief, my closure, my right to mourn my child. That was unforgivable. And I was going to spend whatever time I had left making sure she understood exactly what she'd taken from me. Jim Patterson called me back that evening with information that made my blood run cold. Sarah Donnelly wasn't just an opportunistic identity thief, she was a serial predator who had been targeting grieving families for over a decade. Dorothy, sit down before I tell you this. Jim's voice was grimmer than I'd ever heard it. Sarah Donnelly, real name Sarah Elizabeth Walsh, has been arrested in 4 different states under 6 different aliases. Every single time, she targeted elderly parents who had recently lost adult children. I was already sitting, but I gripped the phone harder. How many families? That we know of. 7 confirmed cases over the past 12 years. But Dorothy, here's the thing, she's never been convicted. Charges have been dropped, evidence has disappeared, witnesses have recanted. She's good at this. Really good. My mind was racing. What happened to those families? The other victims? That's where it gets ugly. 3 of them died under suspicious circumstances while the investigations were ongoing. Natural causes, according to the death certificates, but... Jim's voice trailed off. But what? But in each case, the victim had changed their will shortly before death, leaving everything to their supposed child. And in each case, Sarah disappeared shortly after the funeral. The room seemed to spin around me. I thought about the power of attorney documents, the trust deed, all those papers I'd supposedly signed while drugged. Sarah hadn't just been stealing from me gradually. She'd been setting up to inherit everything when I died. Jim, you think she was planning to kill me? The words hung in the air like poison. I'd suspected Sarah was a thief, a liar, a manipulator. But a murderer? The pattern fits, Dorothy. Get close to the family, gain their trust, gradually gain control of their finances, then... He didn't need to finish. How long do you think I had? Based on the other cases, she usually made her move within 3 years of establishing the relationship. You said she's been there for 2 years. My chest felt tight. So I was probably going to have a heart attack or stroke sometime in the next few months. Something natural, untraceable. Dorothy, you need to be very careful. Sarah's in custody now, but she's made bail before. She has resources, connections. If she thinks you're a threat to her freedom. But I wasn't scared anymore. I was furious. This woman hadn't just stolen from me. She'd stolen from at least 7 other families. She'd murdered elderly parents who had trusted her, who had loved her as their own children. Jim, I need everything you can find on those other cases. Names, dates, what happened to the families afterward. And I need to know who helped her. Someone had to forge documents, someone had to help her establish these false identities. Dorothy, what are you thinking? I'm thinking the police are going to treat this as a financial crime. Maybe they'll get her for identity theft, maybe fraud. But murder, especially murders that look like natural causes, they'll never be able to prove it without more evidence. And you think you can find that evidence? I thought about my burning pot roast, about waking up confused after my Tuesday naps, about signing documents I couldn't remember, about the careful way Sarah had studied me, learned my routines, infiltrated my life so completely that even I had believed she was my daughter. I think I'm the only one who can, I said. I lived with her for 2 years. I saw how she operated up close. And unlike those other families, I'm still alive to fight back. This is dangerous, Dorothy. If you're right about what she's done, then I'm already in danger. The only way to be safe is to make sure she can never hurt anyone else again. After I hung up with Jim, I sat in my quiet house and made a decision that would have terrified the woman I'd been a week ago. But that woman had trusted blindly, loved without question, accepted what she was told without looking deeper. This woman was different. This woman had seen evil wearing her daughter's face, had been violated in the most intimate way possible, and had survived. This woman was going to fight back. I started with the other victims. Using the information Jim had provided, I spent the next 3 days making phone calls to distant relatives, neighbors, anyone who might have known the family Sarah had targeted. It was heartbreaking work, talking to people who were still grieving, still confused about what had happened to their loved ones. But it was also illuminating. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman in Portland had been 82 when her son Michael moved back home after a supposed bankruptcy. Michael had been dead for 3 years from a drug overdose, but Eleanor was so happy to have family close again that she never questioned the small inconsistencies. She died 6 months later from what appeared to be a stroke, leaving everything to Michael, who disappeared the day after the funeral. Mr. Charles Rivera in Phoenix had welcomed his daughter Patricia home after her divorce. The real Patricia had died in a skiing accident 2 years earlier, but Charles was dealing with early-stage dementia and was easily confused about timelines. He died from an apparent heart attack after changing his will to leave his house and savings to Patricia. The pattern was always the same. A vulnerable elderly parent, a dead adult child, a period of gaining trust and financial control, then a convenient death that looked entirely natural. But Sarah had made mistakes. Small ones, but mistakes nonetheless. In Portland, a neighbor remembered that Michael had seemed different, taller than she remembered, with a different laugh. In Phoenix, Charles' doctor had noted that his dementia symptoms seemed to worsen dramatically after his daughter moved home, which was unusual for his type of condition. Most importantly, in Denver, where my real daughter had died, I found someone who had known them both. Rita Morrison was a bartender at O'Malley's pub, where Sarah claimed to have met Melissa. She remembered them both clearly, not just because of what had happened afterward, but because their conversation had stuck with her. "Your daughter was so drunk that night," Rita told me over the phone. Crying about her divorce, about how her husband had cleaned out their accounts. But she kept talking about her mom, about how much she missed you but was too proud to come home. She showed everyone pictures on her phone. You, your house, even your dog. I didn't have a dog. Harold had been allergic. But the other woman, Sarah, you said. She was asking so many questions. What was your mom like? Where did you grow up? What were your favorite memories? At first I thought she was just being a good listener, but looking back. Rita's voice grew troubled. She was taking notes, honey. Actual notes on a napkin. Did you see what happened to them after they left? I saw them get in the same car. Your daughter was too drunk to drive, so Sarah offered her a ride. Melissa was so grateful, kept saying what a good friend Sarah was being. Rita paused. That was the last time anyone saw your daughter alive. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. Rita, would you be willing to talk to the police? To testify about what you saw? Of course. I always wondered what happened that night, if I should have done something different. If I'd known. You couldn't have known, I said, though my heart was breaking for both of us. But we can do something now. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the notes I'd been making. 7 families destroyed. 7 elderly parents murdered. And who knew how many other cases that hadn't been reported or identified? Sarah Donnelly was a serial killer who had found the perfect method, targeting the most vulnerable victims imaginable, gaining their trust and love, then killing them in ways that looked natural while stealing everything they'd worked for their entire lives. And she would have done the same to me if that police officer hadn't knocked on my door. But now I knew. And I had evidence the police didn't have, witnesses they hadn't found, patterns they hadn't identified, connections they hadn't made. The question was what to do with it. I could turn everything over to Detective Morrison, hope that the legal system would work, pray that justice would be served. But I'd seen how that had worked out for the other families. Charges dropped, evidence disappeared, Sarah walking free to find her next victim. Or I could take a different approach. Sarah Donnelly had spent years studying her victims, learning their weaknesses, exploiting their love and trust to destroy them. She thought she understood how grieving parents worked, how easily they could be manipulated. But she'd never met a grieving parent who knew exactly what she was. She'd never faced a victim who was willing to use her own methods against her. She'd never encountered someone who had nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to plan the perfect revenge. If Sarah wanted to play games with vulnerable elderly people, I was happy to show her how the game was really played. By someone who'd had years to perfect it. Sarah made bail 3 days later. I wasn't surprised. Jim had warned me she had resources, and her lawyer was expensive enough to suggest she'd been planning for this possibility. But I was ready for her. She didn't come back to the house immediately. Instead, she went to a motel on the outskirts of town, probably trying to figure out her next move. But I knew she'd return. She had to. There were things in my house she needed, documents, evidence of her other crimes, maybe even money she'd hidden there during her 2 years of living her lie. I spent those 3 days preparing. First, I had the locks changed and installed a security system. Not to keep her out, I wanted her to come back. But I needed to document everything that happened when she did. Second, I moved the most important documents to a safety deposit box at a different bank, one Sarah didn't know about. But I left copies in the house, in places she'd expect to find them, along with some additional items that would be very interesting to her. Third, I set up what Harold would have called a honey trap. Using information from Jim's investigation, I created a file that suggested I'd discovered Sarah's real identity and her history of targeting other families. But I made it look like I'd missed some crucial details that would make her think she still had options, still had ways to salvage her situation. Most importantly, I left evidence that I'd identified her offshore bank accounts. That wasn't entirely a lie. Jim had traced some of the stolen money to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Panama, accounts that contained not just what she'd stolen from me, but apparently what she'd taken from her other victims as well. Millions of dollars, accumulated over a decade of murder and theft. I wanted Sarah to think I was a threat to all of it. The 4th night after her arrest, she came back. The security system alerted me at 2:17 a.m. when she disabled the alarm. Apparently she'd watched me input the code enough times to memorize it. She was good, I'd give her that. But she'd never been up against someone who had learned from Harold's military training. I was waiting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the file spread out on the table where she couldn't miss it. When she walked through the door, she looked different. Gone was any pretense of being the broken, fragile daughter. This was Sarah in her true form, cold, calculating, predatory. "Hello, Dorothy," she said, and even her voice was different. No warmth, no affection, just businesslike efficiency. "Sarah," I nodded. "I was wondering when you'd come back." She glanced at the papers on the table, and I saw her eyes narrow as she recognized what they were. "Doing some research?" "Quite a bit, actually. You've had a busy decade." Sarah walked closer, studying the documents. I'd arranged them carefully, police reports from some of her previous victims, financial records showing her various aliases, and at the top, a bank statement from one of her offshore accounts. "Impressive detective work for an old woman," she said, but I could hear the tension in her voice. "How much do you know?" "Everything." I sipped my coffee calmly. "Eleanor Hoffman, Charles Rivera, the others. I know how you find vulnerable families, how you study them, how you gain their trust. I know about the drugging, the forged documents, the convenient deaths." Sarah's expression didn't change, but her hand moved slightly toward the knife block on the counter. "And what do you plan to do with this information?" "That depends on you." Now she looked surprised. "On me?" I set down my coffee cup and met her eyes. You're very good at what you do, Sarah. Professional. Thorough. But you made one mistake with me. What's that? You let me live long enough to figure it out. I gestured to the bank statement. Account number 7749582 in Grand Cayman. Nearly $4 million. Money you stole from 7 families over 10 years. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. How did you? Does it matter? What matters is what happens next. I leaned back in my chair, trying to project calm I didn't entirely feel. You see, I've been thinking about this situation from your perspective. You're facing serious charges, but they're mostly financial crimes. With a good lawyer and the right plea deal, you might get 5 to 7 years, out in 3 with good behavior. Sarah was listening now, her hand moving away from the knives. But if the families of your other victims find out what really happened to their loved ones, if the police start investigating those deaths as homicides instead of natural causes, well, that changes everything, doesn't it? What do you want? Sarah asked quietly. I want my daughter back, I said, and for the first time since this conversation started, my voice wavered. But since that's impossible, I want the next best thing. Which is? I stood up slowly, every year of my age showing in the movement, making myself appear as non-threatening as possible. I want to offer you a deal. Sarah laughed, but it was a nervous sound. What could you possibly offer me? A way out. I picked up a piece of paper from the table, a bank routing slip I'd prepared. This is a wire transfer authorization for $2 million from your Grand Cayman account to a bank in Costa Rica. Costa Rica has no extradition treaty with the United States for financial crimes. Sarah stared at the paper. You're suggesting I run? I'm suggesting you disappear. Take half the money and vanish. Leave the other half to be distributed to the families you destroyed, anonymous donations that can't be traced back to you. And in return, I don't give this file to Detective Morrison. I don't contact the families of your other victims. I don't turn your offshore banking information over to the FBI. I sat back down. You get away clean, Sarah. New identity, new life, enough money to live comfortably wherever you want to go. Sarah was quiet for a long time, studying me with those calculating eyes. Why would you do that? Why let me go? And here was the most important part, the part everything depended on. I had to make her believe I was exactly what she'd always thought I was, a weak, grieving old woman who just wanted the nightmare to end. Because I'm tired, I said, letting my voice break slightly. I'm 71 years old, Sarah. I've lost my husband, my daughter, my savings, my sense of security. I just want peace. I want to spend whatever time I have left without looking over my shoulder, without waiting for the next court date, without reliving this nightmare over and over. I looked down at my hands. And because part of me almost understands why you did it. You saw lonely old people and you took advantage of them. It was wrong, it was evil, but I understand the opportunity. What I don't understand is why you had to kill them. They would have figured it out eventually, Sarah said simply. Just like you did. Maybe. Or maybe they would have been grateful just to have someone who cared about them, even if it wasn't real. I met her eyes again. That's the difference between us, Sarah. You see victims to be exploited. I still see people to be loved. It was a risk, showing her what she would interpret as weakness. But it was a calculated risk. Sarah's entire criminal career was based on exploiting exactly this kind of vulnerability. She studied the wire transfer authorization again. How do I know you won't change your mind? How do I know you won't turn me in after I'm gone? Because what would be the point? You'd already be beyond the reach of US law enforcement. And because... I hesitated, as if the next words were difficult to say. Because revenge won't bring my daughter back. It won't undo what you've done to me. All it would do is keep the wound open. Sarah was silent for several minutes, weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. All right. But I need guarantees. I need to know you'll destroy this file, that you won't contact anyone else. Of course. I gathered up the papers. There's a fireplace in the living room. We can burn everything together. What Sarah didn't know was that every document on that table was a copy. The originals were already in Detective Morrison's hands, along with my statement and the contact information for all the witnesses I'd found. What she also didn't know was that the wire transfer authorization wasn't real. The account number was correct, but the routing information would send her money into a holding account controlled by the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. And what she definitely didn't know was that I was wearing a wire, and every word of our conversation was being recorded by the police officers positioned outside my house. But Sarah Donnelly was about to learn the most important lesson of her criminal career. Never underestimate a grieving mother who has nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to plan the perfect trap. "Shall we go burn those documents?" I asked, standing up with my coffee cup. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. "Let's do it." She thought she was about to escape justice one more time. She was wrong. The recording of my conversation with Sarah was devastating. Her casual admission to murder, her complete lack of remorse, her matter-of-fact description of how she'd targeted vulnerable families. It was everything the prosecution needed to build a case that would finally stick. But the real breakthrough came when Detective Morrison and the Financial Crimes Unit followed the trail I'd helped them discover. The offshore accounts contained more than just money. They contained detailed records Sarah had kept of all her victims, including photographs, personal information, and what appeared to be trophies from each family she destroyed. Among those files was something that broke my heart all over again: photos of my real Melissa from that night at O'Malley's pub, including several taken after she'd passed out drunk in Sarah's car. Sarah had documented everything, treating my daughter's final hours like a trophy hunt. But there was something else in those files that changed everything. "Dorothy, you need to see this," Detective Morrison said, calling me to the station a week after Sarah's arrest. He looked grim, but also strangely hopeful. "We found something in Sarah's records that, well, it's about your daughter." He led me to a small conference room where several files were spread across a table. Crime scene photos, medical reports, financial records, the bureaucratic remains of Sarah's decade-long killing spree. "We've been going through everything Sarah kept, and we found her notes about selecting victims. She was incredibly systematic about it, researching families for months before making contact." Detective Morrison pulled out a thick folder labeled MC, Denver. Inside were dozens of photographs of Melissa, some clearly taken without her knowledge, others that appeared to be from social media, and several from the night she died. "Sarah had been watching your daughter for at least 3 months before that night at the bar," Morrison explained. "She knew about the divorce, about Melissa's financial problems, about her reluctance to come home for help. But Dorothy, she also knew something else." He pulled out a document I'd never seen before, a hospital admission record from Denver General Hospital dated 2 weeks before Melissa's death. "Your daughter was pregnant," Morrison said quietly, "about 8 weeks along. She'd just found out, and according to her medical records, she was planning to have the baby and raise it as a single mother." The world tilted around me. Pregnant. My Melissa had been pregnant with my grandchild, and I'd never known. She'd died carrying the baby she was planning to raise, the child I would never get to meet. "There's more," Morrison continued, his voice gentle but professional. "The crash that killed your daughter wasn't an accident. Sarah had been tampering with cars for years. It's how she staged most of the deaths of her victims. But with Melissa, she made a mistake." He pulled out another document, an insurance report I'd never been shown. The brake lines were cut, but not completely. Sarah wanted it to look like mechanical failure, but the insurance investigator noted that the cuts were too clean, too precise. He recommended a police investigation, but the case was never followed up because there was no apparent motive. "Until now," I whispered. "Until now. We have Sarah's notes describing exactly how she planned and executed your daughter's murder. She killed Melissa to steal her identity, Dorothy. Your daughter didn't die because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was murdered specifically so Sarah could take her place in your life." I sat in that conference room and grieved for my daughter all over again, but differently this time. Not for someone who had died in a random accident, but for someone who had been murdered while carrying my grandchild. For a young woman who had been planning to come home to me, who had been working up the courage to ask for help, who had been killed before she could take those first steps toward rebuilding her life. But along with the grief came something else. A sense of purpose that burned hotter than anything I'd felt in years. Sarah Donnelly hadn't just stolen from 7 families. She hadn't just murdered 7 elderly parents for money. She had murdered my pregnant daughter specifically to get to me, had killed my unborn grandchild as part of her plan. "Detective Morrison," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. "I want to do whatever it takes to make sure she never hurts another family. Dorothy, the evidence we have now, the recording, the financial records, her own documentation of the crimes, it's enough to put her away for life. Multiple life sentences, actually. Good. But I want to make sure there aren't other victims out there, other families who don't know what really happened to their loved ones." I looked at the files spread across the table. Sarah kept records of everyone she targeted. "I want to help you contact those families, help them understand what really happened." Morrison nodded. "That would be incredibly helpful. Some of these cases go back over a decade, and the families never got closure." Over the next 2 months, I became an unofficial consultant to the police investigation. Using Sarah's meticulous records, we identified 12 families across 8 states who had been targeted by her over the years. Not all of them had been successfully infiltrated, some had grown suspicious too quickly, others had family members who asked too many questions. But for those she had successfully deceived, the pattern was always the same. A dead adult child, a grieving parent, a period of gaining trust, gradual financial control, and then a convenient death. Making those phone calls was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Explaining to elderly relatives that their loved one hadn't died of natural causes, that they'd been murdered for money by someone they trusted as family. Watching their grief transform into the same burning rage I felt. But it was also healing in a way I hadn't expected. These families had been carrying guilt for years, wondering if they'd missed signs of illness, if they could have done something differently. Learning the truth was painful, but it also lifted a burden they'd been carrying unknowingly. More importantly, their testimony provided corroborating evidence that strengthened the case against Sarah exponentially. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Sarah's defense team tried to paint her as a victim herself, someone who had grown up in foster care and learned to survive by any means necessary. They suggested that the deaths of her elderly victims had been coincidental, that she was a thief but not a murderer. But the evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's own records, the recording of her confession to me, testimony from surviving family members, forensic evidence from crime scenes that had been reinvestigated. It painted a picture of a calculating serial killer who had perfected a method of murder that looked natural. I testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through my experience with Sarah, explaining how she had gained my trust, how she had systematically stolen my life and planned my death. I told them about my daughter's final night, about the pregnancy I'd never known about the grandchild I would never meet. But the most powerful moment came when the prosecutor played the recording of Sarah's confession. Listening to her casual description of how she'd murdered my daughter, how she'd studied me like prey, how she'd planned to kill me just like the others, the jury was visibly shaken. Sarah showed no emotion during any of it. She sat at the defense table taking notes, occasionally whispering to her lawyers, looking for all the world like someone attending a business meeting rather than her own murder trial. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, including 7 counts of first-degree murder, Sarah finally showed a reaction. Not remorse, not fear, but anger. Pure, undiluted rage at being caught, at being held accountable, at losing the game she'd been playing for so long. The judge sentenced her to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As they led her out of the courtroom in shackles, Sarah looked directly at me for the first time since her arrest. I expected to see hatred, or defiance, or even some twisted form of respect for the trap I'd set. Instead, I saw something that chilled me to the bone: disappointment. She looked at me like I'd let her down, like I'd failed some test she'd set for me. Even now, even facing the rest of her life in prison, she still saw me as a victim who had simply gotten lucky. She still didn't understand that she'd awakened something in me that had been sleeping for years. She still didn't realize that in trying to destroy me, she'd created the very person capable of destroying her. But I understood something she never would: the difference between victims and survivors. Victims let things happen to them. Survivors fight back. And sometimes, if they're very careful and very determined, survivors win. Sarah Donnelly was sent to a maximum security women's prison in Colorado, where she would spend the rest of her life without any possibility of parole. But for me, her conviction was just the beginning of a much larger mission. The offshore accounts containing the money she'd stolen from her victims were seized by the government, and after a lengthy legal process, those funds were distributed to the families she'd destroyed. It wasn't enough to undo the damage she'd caused, but for elderly relatives struggling with medical bills and mortgage payments, it provided some measure of financial relief. For me, the money she'd stolen, nearly $200,000, was returned along with substantial damages from her seized assets. But I didn't need it anymore. Harold's military pension and social security provided enough for my simple needs, and I had something more valuable than money now: purpose. I established the Melissa Chen Foundation for Elder Protection, focusing on educating families about the warning signs of financial elder abuse and identity theft. We developed programs to help elderly people protect themselves from predators like Sarah, and we worked with law enforcement to identify and investigate suspicious cases. But the Foundation's most important work was something more personal: helping other families who had been targeted by con artists and identity thieves get the justice they deserved. In the 2 years since Sarah's conviction, we've helped solve 8 similar cases across the country. Not all of them involved murder, most were simple financial exploitation, but each one represented a family that had been betrayed by someone they trusted. Jim Patterson became our lead investigator, using his military and law enforcement contacts to track down criminals who thought they'd gotten away with their crimes. We worked closely with police departments, district attorneys, and federal agencies to build cases that would actually stick. We also created a support network for victims' families. There's something uniquely devastating about being betrayed by someone you thought was family, someone you loved and trusted completely. Traditional therapy often doesn't address the specific trauma of having your grief weaponized against you. Our support groups met monthly in community centers across 3 states, bringing together people who had survived what we'd survived. Elderly parents who had been deceived by fake children, siblings who had discovered their long-lost relatives were actually criminals, families who had learned that their loved ones hadn't died naturally but had been murdered for money. It was difficult work, emotionally draining in ways I hadn't expected. Every case brought back memories of my own experience with Sarah. Every family meeting reminded me of the daughter and grandchild I'd lost. But it was also healing. Each criminal we helped catch, each family we helped get justice, each elderly person we educated about protecting themselves, it all felt like I was honoring Melissa's memory in a way that sitting quietly at home never could have. The hardest case we worked on came 18 months after Sarah's conviction. Marie Kowalski was 78 years old and lived alone in Detroit after her husband's death from cancer. Her son David had been killed in Afghanistan 3 years earlier, and she'd been struggling with grief and loneliness when a young man appeared at her door claiming to be David's army buddy. "David talked about you all the time," he told her. "He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd check on his mom." The young man, who called himself Marcus Williams, had been a perfect companion for Marie. He helped with household repairs, drove her to medical appointments, and gradually became like a son to her. When he suggested moving in to help take care of her, she was grateful for the company. Marcus had been living with Marie for 8 months when her neighbor called our foundation. Something felt wrong, the neighbor said. Marie seemed confused lately, often forgetting conversations they'd had. And there had been a lot of activity at the house: repair trucks, real estate agents, men in suits with briefcases. Jim and I drove to Detroit to meet with the neighbor, a retired teacher named Helen who had known Marie for 15 years. "She's not the same person," Helen told us over coffee in her kitchen, which had a clear view of Marie's backyard. "Marie was always sharp as a tack, but lately she seems foggy, disoriented. And this Marcus person, he never lets her out of his sight." "Have you met him?" I asked. "Once, briefly. He was polite enough, but there was something off about him. And he knew things about David that seemed too personal for just an army buddy." Helen's suspicions were confirmed when we did background research on Marcus Williams. The man living with Marie wasn't David's friend. He was a career criminal named Anthony Ross who specialized in targeting military families. He used obituaries and military records to create false connections with deceased service members, then approached their grieving families with elaborate stories designed to gain their trust. But Anthony was more sophisticated than most con artists. Instead of just stealing money and disappearing, he had Marie sign papers transferring ownership of her house to a trust he controlled. He'd also been gradually increasing her medications. Marie was diabetic and took blood pressure medication, both of which could be dangerous in higher doses. "He's planning to kill her," Jim said after reviewing the medical records we'd obtained. "Just like Sarah did with her victims. Make it look like natural causes, inherit everything legally." We had evidence of financial exploitation, but proving attempted murder would be much more difficult. Anthony hadn't made any admissions like Sarah had, and he was being much more careful about documenting his crimes. That's when I made a decision that scared everyone around me, including myself. I was going to go undercover. "Absolutely not," Jim said when I proposed the plan. "Dorothy, you're 73 years old, and this man is planning murder. It's too dangerous. It's the only way, I insisted. Anthony targets elderly military widows, right? Well, I'm an elderly military widow. Harold served in Vietnam and Korea. I know enough about military life to be convincing. My plan was to approach Anthony as a potential new victim. I would pretend to be recently widowed, lonely, and wealthy. If I could get him to target me the way he'd targeted Marie, I might be able to record admissions that would be useful in court. It took weeks to set up properly. We created a false identity for me, Dorothy Walsh, widow of Colonel Robert Walsh, recently moved to Detroit to be closer to family. We rented an apartment in an upscale senior community, furnished it with photos of Harold in his military uniforms, and established a bank account with enough money to make me look like an attractive target. Then we waited. Anthony took the bait within a week. I was sitting in a coffee shop near Marie's neighborhood, a place Helen had told us he frequented, when he approached my table. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help noticing your husband's medals," he said, gesturing to the military pin on my jacket. "My late friend served in Vietnam too. Colonel David Kowalski." And there it was, the opening line of his con, connecting himself to a dead soldier to gain my trust. What followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Anthony was charming, attentive, and incredibly skilled at reading emotional cues. He let me talk about my recent loss, offered just the right amount of sympathy, and gradually began sharing stories about his friend David that were clearly designed to make me feel connected to him. Over the next 3 weeks, I played the role of the lonely widow perfectly. I let Anthony convince me to let him help with errands, invited him to my apartment for dinner, and gradually allowed him to become part of my daily routine. All while wearing a wire and documenting every conversation. Anthony's mistake was the same one Sarah had made. He underestimated his victim. He saw a grieving old woman and assumed she was helpless, vulnerable, easy to manipulate. He never suspected that I was recording his detailed descriptions of how he'd gained Marie's trust, his casual mentions of increasing her medication dosages, his plans for inheriting her house after her inevitable health decline. When we had enough evidence, the FBI moved in. Anthony was arrested at Marie's house while helping her organize financial documents that would have transferred her remaining assets to accounts he controlled. Marie was taken to the hospital, where doctors confirmed she'd been systematically poisoned with her own medications. She recovered, but slowly. The psychological damage of betrayal was harder to heal than the physical effects of the poisoning. Anthony was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for attempted murder, elder abuse, and fraud. Marie got her house back and received compensation from his seized assets. But more importantly, our undercover operation had given law enforcement a new model for investigating these types of crimes. Other police departments began reaching out to us for consultation on similar cases. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and emotionally devastating. But it was also necessary, because for every criminal we caught, there were elderly people who were safe. For every case we solved, there were families who got justice. For every predator we exposed, there were grieving parents who wouldn't be victimized by someone wearing their child's face. It wasn't the retirement I'd planned. But it was the life my daughter's death had given me. Purpose born from pain, strength forged from betrayal, justice carved out of grief. And every day, I felt her with me. My real Melissa, the one who had been planning to come home, planning to raise my grandchild, planning to rebuild her life. She'd never gotten that chance. But I was getting mine. 5 years have passed since that October evening when a police officer knocked on my door and turned my world upside down. I'm 76 now, and there are mornings when my arthritis reminds me that I'm not the young woman who once chased toddlers around a playground. But there are also mornings when I wake up with a sense of purpose that makes me feel more alive than I had in years. The Melissa Chen Foundation has grown beyond anything I imagined when I started it. We now operate in 12 states, with a network of investigators, attorneys, and volunteers who work together to protect elderly Americans from the kind of predators who destroyed my family. We've helped solve over 40 cases in the past 5 years. Not all of them involved murder. Most were financial exploitation, identity theft, or long-term fraud. But each case represented a family that got justice, a criminal who was held accountable, and most importantly, an elderly person who was protected from further harm. The Foundation's success has brought media attention I never wanted. Television interviews, newspaper articles, even a book deal that I turned down because I didn't want to profit from other people's pain. But the attention has been useful in one important way. It's helped us reach more victims. Almost every week, I get calls or letters from families who suspect their elderly relatives are being victimized. Adult children who notice their parents' personalities changing, neighbors who observe suspicious activities, sometimes even the victims themselves who have started to question what's happening to them. Last month, I got a call that reminded me why this work matters so much. Mrs. Chen? My name is Patricia Hoffman. I think someone is trying to do to my mother what that woman did to you. Patricia's mother was Ellen, an 8-year-old widow in Sacramento whose son had died in a motorcycle accident 2 years earlier. 3 months ago, a woman claiming to be her son's girlfriend had appeared at Ellen's door, saying she was pregnant with his child and had nowhere else to go. At first, Mom was overjoyed, Patricia told me. The idea that part of Tommy was still alive, that she was going to have a grandchild, it gave her something to live for again. But Patricia had grown suspicious when the woman, who called herself Lisa, began isolating Ellen from her family and friends. Doctor's appointments were rescheduled without explanation. Ellen's weekly bridge game was cancelled because she was too tired. Most concerning, Ellen had started showing signs of confusion and memory loss that hadn't been there before. It's exactly what you described in your interviews, Patricia said. The gradual control, the isolation, the personality changes. I think she's drugging my mother. I was on a plane to Sacramento the next day. Working with local police and Jim Patterson, we set up surveillance on Ellen's house and began investigating Lisa's background. What we found was terrifying but familiar. Lisa Morrison was actually Linda Vasquez, a woman with a history of targeting grieving families across the Southwest. Linda had learned from Sarah Donnelly's mistakes. She wasn't keeping detailed records of her crimes, wasn't using the same methods repeatedly, and wasn't moving as quickly to gain financial control. She was more patient, more careful, and potentially more dangerous because of it. But she'd made one crucial error. She'd underestimated Patricia's love for her mother. Unlike me 5 years earlier, Patricia had recognized the warning signs early. She'd trusted her instincts instead of dismissing her concerns as paranoia. And she'd reached out for help before it was too late. We caught Linda in the act of forging Ellen's signature on a new will that would have left everything to the mother of Tommy's child. We also found evidence that she'd been gradually increasing Ellen's blood pressure medication, a method that would eventually cause a stroke that would look completely natural. Ellen recovered fully once the medication manipulation stopped. Linda was sentenced to 15 years in prison. And Patricia became one of our most effective advocates, speaking at senior centers and community groups about recognizing the warning signs of elder abuse. You saved my mother's life, Patricia told me after Linda's sentencing. But more than that, you gave me the knowledge I needed to protect her. That's what the foundation is really about, not just catching criminals after they've already caused damage, but preventing that damage from happening in the first place. We've developed educational programs that teach families how to protect their elderly relatives. We work with financial institutions to train employees to recognize suspicious transactions. We partner with law enforcement agencies to help them identify patterns that might indicate elder exploitation. Most importantly, we help families trust their instincts. So many of the cases we see involve relatives who knew something was wrong but talked themselves out of taking action. They didn't want to seem paranoid, didn't want to upset family dynamics, didn't want to believe that someone could be that calculating and cruel. I understand that reluctance. If someone had told me 5 years ago that the woman I thought was my daughter was actually a serial killer planning to murder me, I would have thought they were crazy. But now I know better. I know that evil can wear a familiar face, that predators can be incredibly sophisticated, and that the people who seem most trustworthy can sometimes be the most dangerous. I also know that fighting back is possible. Last week, I received a letter that brought tears to my eyes. It was from Marie Kowalski, the Detroit woman we'd saved from Anthony Ross 3 years ago. She was writing to tell me that she'd just celebrated her 81st birthday surrounded by real friends and genuine family members. Before you came into my life, she wrote, I was so lonely and confused. I thought Anthony cared about me, and I was grateful for any attention, even if it felt wrong sometimes. But you taught me that I deserve better than that. You taught me that I'm worth protecting. Marie had become a volunteer with our Michigan chapter, helping other elderly people recognize manipulation and exploitation. She'd found purpose in her own survival, just like I had. That's what Sarah Donnelly and criminals like her never understand. They see elderly people as weak, isolated, and vulnerable. They think that age makes us easy targets, that grief makes us desperate enough to accept any comfort, even if it comes from someone with ulterior motives. But they're wrong about what happens when we survive their attacks. They create warriors. Every elderly person who escapes their manipulation becomes someone who can recognize it in others. Every family who gets justice becomes advocates for other families. Every case we solve creates more people who understand how these criminals operate and how to stop them. Sarah is still in prison, serving her 7 life sentences. I get reports from the warden occasionally. She's been involved in several violent incidents with other inmates, always trying to manipulate and control the people around her. Even in maximum security, she can't stop being what she is. But her victims have moved on to become something she never expected, protectors of others who might have fallen into the same trap. The other day, I was going through some of Harold's old things and found a letter Melissa had written to him while he was stationed overseas, just after she'd graduated from college. "Daddy," she wrote in her careful handwriting, "I hope I can be the kind of person who makes you proud. Someone who stands up for people who can't stand up for themselves, someone who fights for what's right even when it's hard." Reading those words, I realized that my daughter's dream had come true, just not in the way any of us expected. Melissa never got the chance to be that person herself. But her death, her murder, had created the opportunity for dozens of other people to become protectors and advocates. Her memory had inspired a foundation that had saved lives, caught criminals, and given justice to families who thought they'd never get it. Sarah Donnelly had killed my daughter to steal her identity and destroy my life. Instead, she'd given both of us a legacy that would outlast anything she'd ever built through lies and manipulation. As I finish writing this story, I want you to know something. If you're watching this and thinking about an elderly relative who's been acting differently lately, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If you're an older person who's been isolated from family and friends by someone who claims to care about you, reach out for help. There are people who will believe you, who will investigate your concerns, who will protect you. And if you're someone who's been victimized by a con artist, a manipulator, or someone who's stolen your identity or your trust, know that it's never too late to fight back. The criminals who prey on elderly people count on our silence, our shame, our unwillingness to admit we've been fooled. They count on us being too proud to ask for help, too isolated to know where to turn. But they're wrong about us. We're stronger than they think. We're smarter than they assume. And when we work together, we're absolutely devastating to their plans. Sarah Donnelly spent years perfecting her methods, studying her victims, building what she thought was the perfect crime. But she made one fatal error. She messed with the wrong mother. And now, every time we catch another criminal like her, every time we save another family from the kind of betrayal I experienced, every time we help another elderly person recognize manipulation before it's too late, we prove that justice doesn't have an expiration date. My name is Dorothy Chen. I'm 76 years old, and I've spent the past 5 years of my life making sure that what happened to my family never happens to anyone else's. If this story has touched you, if you've learned something that might help protect someone you love, please share it. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let me know if you have elderly relatives who might benefit from our resources. Most importantly, remember this: it's never too late to fight back, it's never too late to seek justice, and it's never too late to turn your pain into purpose. Sarah thought she was stealing my life. Instead, she gave me the most important work I've ever done. And that's a gift I'll spend the rest of my years passing on to others. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring enough to watch until the end. And thank you for being the kind of person who believes that justice matters, no matter how long it takes to achieve. Take care of each other. Trust your instincts. And never, ever give up on fighting for what's right.